French and Indian War. The real problems between the colonials and the British might have been traced to the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. But we call it the French and Indian War because we fought it against the French and Indians. So we named the war after the name of our enemies. The French and Indians together fought against us. The conflict started out in the colonies. Here's the source of the conflict. You had the Ohio Valley, particularly the area around what is today Pittsburgh. And if you know anything about Pittsburgh, the Allegheny and Susquehanna rivers come together right there in Pittsburgh and form the Ohio. Then the Ohio River goes on to separate West Virginia from Ohio and to separate Ohio from Kentucky and Kentucky from Illinois and Indiana. Fairly big river, I'll say. I went on a cruise on down it one time. But anyway, the Ohio River begins there at Pittsburgh. So it's a strategic location. The British claimed it was theirs. The French said it's ours. The French had a fort with a small congregation of people there at the fort. Well, the Governor of Virginia, now folk, the man, don't misunderstand me, this man's name was Governor Dinwiddie. Don't think it was Governor Dinwiddie. No, it's Governor D-I-N, Dinwiddie. Anyway, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sent a delegation to the French to ask the French to leave. The delegation was headed up by a very young man. Your book almost calls him a boy. His name was George Washington. It's the first time in history here. George Washington was only 22 years old, but George Washington had some half-brothers, and these half-brothers owned the company that claimed the land in the Ohio Valley. So young George Washington was sent, and George Washington was there. He got along with the French well. The French treated him kindly. He did not know French, but he spoke through an interpreter, and he asked the French to leave. You know you're encroaching on land that belongs to the King of England. The French politely said, we're not going to leave. But in the meantime, George Washington had the chance to look around. He thought, hey, there's not very many folk here. So he went back to Governor Dinwiddie and said, the French won't leave. Governor Dinwiddie, but also they only have just a handful of troops there, and they don't have very many men. They can be easily dislodged. So Governor Dinwiddie sent George Washington to command so many, like 500 or 600 men, some of them Indians and some of them colonials, militiamen. Their job was to drive the French out. Things did not go well for Washington. He experienced his only surrender of his life. Particularly his Indians that followed him got out of hand, and they slaughtered some French. Well, the French got a contingent of reinforcements. They were expecting, I guess, and make a long story short, they forced George Washington to surrender. George Washington built a fort called Fort Necessity real quickly, but the French overwhelmed him, and he was forced to surrender and go back home in defeat. George Washington's first military clash. Now, I want to say this about George Washington as a military leader. In his lifetime, he engaged in 18 battles. He won 4 and lost 14. And some of his losses were due to his own fault. I mean, if you read an elementary school history book, and I taught elementary school and I homeschooled my own children, but they might make it sound like George Washington was the best military commander who ever lived. Such is not the case. However, I want to say this about Washington that Napoleon can't say. Napoleon won more than 40 battles and lost about 4. But George Washington won his last battle. Napoleon did not. Big difference, folk. Anyway, George Washington he won his last one. Anyway. But this was the beginning of the French and Indian War. Actually, there were about 40 Mingo. Well, Washington's force was only 160 men. I'll stand corrected. But the Mingo Indians scalped some of the Frenchmen, and this made this upset the Frenchmen greatly. Well, the Indians wouldn't side with the Virginians, and when a large army came, like I say, George Washington had to surrender. The French sent George Washington a message, said, tell your governor, Governor Denwoody, we're not going to leave, we're here to stay. And they did not leave. Well, the Iroquois Indians had been bitter enemies of the French for a long time, and they still were. When the war broke out, two men, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson, they drew up a plan called the Albany Plan of Union. They said what we colonial people need to do is quit being 13 colonies and join and become one. And a famous cartoon time showed a snake divided into 13 parts, and the caption of the cartoon read, "Join or die." In other words, if the snake could join itself together, 13 pieces, it would survive. If it didn't, it was going to die. The Albany Plan of Union was the first known attempt to get the colonies to unite. Now, it failed. It failed partly because the colonies were not ready to unite, and the colonies did not want to give up their individuality to join for a common cause. Most people opposed it. So the Albany Plan of Union came to nothing. But the idea was that we can get together, join up, and together we can fight and overpower the French living in North America. Instead, much of the fighting was done by the British Army that came across the sea to fight the French and the Indians, except for the Iroquois, who were on the English side anyway. But the English Army, now, this led to a lot of friction. I've read a couple of biographies about Paul Revere, and Paul Revere joined the British Army, as did some other colonials, including George Washington. The colonials were made fun of, laughed at, and generally assigned to the menial task of doing just the stuff that the other British soldiers would not do, carrying out the garbage, driving the supply wagons. As another example, Daniel Boone thought, hey, the British should realize how good I am. I know the territory, and I hope to serve as a scout. The British took one look at him and made him a mule truck driver. They did not consider his abilities to be worth anything at all. In the case of Paul Revere, he got together a bunch of colonials, and as soon as the British saw him, they laughed and said, hey, you're people, you can't march. I don't know about you, but I've personally found marching in step to be somewhat difficult. I had a problem when I was in a high school marching band. Had a problem with it when I was in the Army. I guess eventually I learned it a little bit, but I had trouble because I have to think about what I'm doing. That's why I never did well with a typewriter keyboard, never did well on a piano keyboard either, never did well, because you have to do these things without thinking. If you have to think about what you're doing, so I have to think about, my marching was, anyway, leaving that. But the colonial army was made fun of, and also the British insisted that the army have very highly polished boots and everyone be in uniform. And Paul Revere finally went to a British officer one day and said, hey, how come it's so important that we have every button lined up? And the British officer treated him with scorn and contempt, and Paul Revere spent his time wondering why he didn't get better treatment. And maybe the British officer didn't know, but he always wondered. But anyway, basically, the point I'm trying to make is the British made fun of the colonial way of fighting. The British made up a song, this is not in a book, called Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle has some really, really bad overtones to it, but nevertheless, it was the British making fun of the colonials' way of fighting. One line of the song gives, Captain Washington was giving orders to his men. I guess there was 1 million. Actually, there were far, far fewer than that. And what they wasted every day, I wish it could be saved. Actually, they saved everything, including the stuff that should have been thrown out. But making fun of the colonials' way of fighting, They've created a whole lot of bad blood between the British and the colonials. Now, your book talks about this. General Braddock. General Braddock was sent to take Fort Duquesne, which is today called Pittsburgh. And it was the same area that George Washington gone to, the area of the Ohio Valley. General Braddock took George Washington with him, and Braddock promised, said, Mr. Washington, I'll give you a commission. At that time, only one colonial had ever earned a commission in the British Army. But he said, I'll give you a commission after this campaign is over, if you can do well. Problem was, General Braddock never lived to give the commission. Yes?
I just wanted to question before, when they were having the war between the French and the British here, were they having conflicts over there in Europe at the same time? Or it was
Yeah, okay. The 7 Years' War and what's going on in Europe. The 7 Years' War was actually a world war. And the conflict was between the French and the British mostly. But the Spanish also got involved. The Spanish got involved on the British side. And they wound up having conflicts in the West Indies, conflicts even as far away as India. And there are actually two world wars. The War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War that occurred pretty close together. And they were both, for all practical purposes, world wars. So what we call World War I was actually World War III, but we don't think of it that way. But yes, the 7 Years' War was the French and Indian War over here. It was a world war. Conflict on both sides of the Atlantic and even in the Far East. Anyway, like I say, Braddock took Daniel Boone into his army, and Braddock made Daniel Boone just a mule truck driver, to Daniel Boone's very much discontent. George Washington tried to warn Braddock, as did other colonials, hey, you don't know how to fight this kind of war. Braddock said, I have fought wars in Europe. I know how to fight. The way they fought wars in Europe, I mean, this works in the open plain. They'd have about 3 lines of men. The first line, when the sergeant would raise his rifle, level his rifle, lock, pull the hammer back, and fire. Then that first line would step back a couple of paces. The second line would step forward. They'd raise their rifles while the first line was reloading, level their line, and fire. Then the third line would step forward while the second line got behind the first line. And they could keep a bunch of volleys of fire going all at once. Now, it wasn't like they all fired at once, because you could not get those Flintstone muskets to all fire when they were supposed to. So it was like popcorn. They'd fire pop, 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 pop. Not all at one time like they were, because, again, the rifles did not work in unison like they were supposed to. But this fighting worked pretty well in the open field. They could keep the firepower on the enemy. What they didn't realize was these Indians fought from behind rocks, from behind bushes, and behind trees, and the French learned that too. Braddock had a road cut, and he marched his men straight and tall with their bright red coats. They fought well, the British that is, but they were standing there exposed, and they could not see the enemy. When the firing started, all of a sudden the woods became alive with gunfire. The British soldiers could not see the enemy. Braddock was killed. Now, this book doesn't mention this. The story goes that George Washington then took command and tried to rally the troops, but the troops were in too bad a state of panic to be rallied. One Indian later told George Washington, I shot 6 times at you, and I know I hit you a few times, but George Washington's coat showed that he had 4 bullet holes, but he was not hurt. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. He would get on another horse and try to ride and rally the troops, but it was to no avail. The British Army was thoroughly licked by an enemy that they hardly even saw. One man said, I never saw more than 5 or 6 Indians at a time. As for Daniel Boone, he was keeping a diary. His diary does not tell anything about the battle. What his diary tells us that 4 days after the battle was over, he was in his town in North Carolina. Now, we've decided a man can go from the Ohio Valley to North Carolina in 4 days, but a man has to be pumping himself pretty hard to do it. We think Daniel Boone took off as soon as the battle started and kept on running until he got all the way to North Carolina without stopping. Yeah. Again, I'm not saying I blame him. I mean, he was treated badly by the British anyway. But And of course, your book mentions how that Braddock had a lot of contempt for the colonials and the contempt for colonial advice on how to fight. Braddock was soundly defeated.